Okay everyone, so in this video we're going to continue working with ADO.NET controls, but in this case we're going to code the objects from scratch as opposed to using the GUI tools in the data sources window to establish a connection to the database and create the data set and all that. So basically this is a simple application. We're browsing through Harry Potter books. There's a delete option as well as an update if you want to maybe change the price on something. So we'll look at these operations. And here's a look at the database behind the scenes. It's very simple. We just have one book table with a book ID, the title, author, and price. So very straightforward example here. And what I'll do is, hang on here. I want to show you the front end here. Notice there's no component tray, no ADO.NET controls, because we are not using the data sources pane to establish them. We're coding them in this case. So let's take a look at the code behind the scenes. And I'm not going to describe it all in this one video, but there will be maybe a couple of other videos after this to do the various operations. But what we have here in the form load, I have this call to a read data method, which I have created. This is just like a hand-coded method, which I've called read data. You can call it whatever you want, but it makes sense because as we are deleting records or updating records, changing the records in the database, you want to be able to refresh the view of the records so the user can see what exactly the data looks like at that moment. So it makes sense to put the read data in its own method that you can just call whenever you need it, because we will be opening the connection to the database and rereading the data many times as the program runs and the user interacts with the data. So let me go to the top here. We have this is just a list, a basic list of type book. Oh, it just real quickly, there is a book class behind the scenes with the title, the author, the price, and the book ID. So just a very basic class with some gets and sets and some overloaded constructors. So we have a list of type book, which I've called inventory. And ultimately, we're going to read records out of the database, put the data into book objects. In this case, we'll have 7 book objects, 1 for each book in the database, and then all those book objects are just going to end up in a list, which we've called inventory. And so basically some ADO.NET objects up here. We have a connection object, OLEDB connection, which we would use to connect to an Access database. I'm calling it CONN, C-O-N-N. And the OLEDB command object, which I'm calling COM, this is almost like a vehicle to carry our SQL commands to the database. Nothing happens in a database without SQL going back and forth, some sort of SQL statement. We have several SQL statements in this program, and they are, again, kind of packaged up and carried by this command object to the database, delivered to the database through the command object. And then this is an object that we haven't talked about at all yet. It's a data reader, and really it's exactly as the name implies. This is an object that will read records or read data elements from a database through our connection. So that'll come in handy when we're obviously populating the list with data. And then we have, because this is one of those back and next programs with like back and next buttons, we do have to keep track of the current book. You know, there's no like binding source in this program. So it's almost like the old techniques that we were doing very early in the semester, like in week 2 and 3 when we were first learning the list and going back and next with products. That's exactly what this is. So really the only new part to us is reading data from the database. Once it's in the list, we're home free and we're back into where we were like several weeks ago. So anyway, in the form load, we're putting in a call to read data. So let's take a look at read data, and then we'll look at the individual operations, the adding and updating and deleting in other videos. So the first thing we'll do is open a connection to the database, and you have to hand type the connection string. It's not like setting it up in the data sources pane where you can just browse for the database. So what you need to do is be very, very careful with your typing in this case. So then we're going to put that connection string into a variable, or our connection object, which we've called con, okay? And then we can call upon con to open that connection. So now we have an open channel to the database, all right? So that's the first step. And then we will establish a SQL statement, select all from book. This is basically saying, give me all the Harry Potter books, all fields or columns in the table, and give me all books. We're not filtering in any way, just a very basic select from book statement. And then, as I said, the com object is, it's almost like a vehicle for that SQL statement to get to the database. So we're going to put our SQL statement, which we've called cell books, into that object, and then we also have to provide the connection object created in the previous lines. And then now the com object is kind of locked and loaded, so to speak, and we're ready to use it. So now it comes our book reader, which, as I said, his job is to read data from the database. And this is the syntax we'll use, book reader equals, and this is our command object created in the previous line, execute reader. We haven't seen that type of code in our class before yet, but here it is. And then this is optional here, but when you set it up like this, command behavior dot close connection, when all the data is read into the program, the connection to the database will be closed. And that's good practice. You typically will not leave those connections hanging open when you're not in the database. And you're really only in the database when you're executing an operation against the database, such as selecting records, getting them out, or updating records, deleting records. But that's just like a second in time. And then when that's over, you should close the connection as opposed to leaving them hanging open. Okay, so anyway, we have a while loop here to read the data in using our data reader or book reader object. I should note that the read method will return a true while there is still data to be read. So while there are still books or book records in the table that we're looking at, then this guy keeps returning true. So you can set that up with a while loop that's going to keep running while there's still data, which is what we want in this case. So then, excuse me, we're just reading the data elements in one at a time. First, the ID. Notice you have to parse. You have to be mindful of data types when you're using this technique. But we're using our book reader. Be very careful with the column names. This has got to be the actual column name in the database. And you cannot have any error there when you're coding the column. So it's got to match your columns perfectly. If you're not sure, open the database and take a second look. So we're reading the data in one item at a time, one column at a time from the database, and then when we're putting them into variables, all right? And then once those variables are set and they have the data in them, then we'll just create a brand new book object and then add it to the inventory. And at this point, we are, I'll say, home free. And these techniques from this point on are really just like going back and next. This is like what we were doing, as I said, very early in the course. So just real quickly, look at this next button, click event. Okay, we've done this many times. Way before we were talking about ADO.NET, we were doing this kind of code, and then even the back button too. So in that case, we're home free. Now in the next video, we will look at the delete operation.